Iran told the United States it is collapsing, not metaphorically, not as a negotiating tactic dressed up in diplomatic language. Privately, through back channels, the Islamic Republic of Iran communicated to Washington that it is in a state of collapse and needs relief fast. The regime that spent 47 years telling its own people and the entire world that it would never beg, that it would stand alone against any pressure, that bending to the West was by definition a betrayal of everything the revolution stood for, that regime is now on its knees. And the question you should be asking, the question the American media is largely failing to ask with any seriousness or depth, is what happens next. Because what happens next doesn't just affect Iran, it affects every American who pays an electric bill, fills a gas tank, or buys groceries. The Islamic Republic of Iran is collapsing in real time, and the decisions being made in the next few days could either end this crisis or detonate it into something far worse. That is what we are digging into today, and we are not going to sugarcoat a single word of it. If this kind of reporting matters to you, the kind that doesn't pull punches, doesn't take sides, and doesn't treat you like you can't handle the truth, hit subscribe right now and turn on your notifications. Because this situation is moving faster than almost anyone in mainstream media is tracking it, and you need to stay ahead of it. Let's start with the economics, because the economics are where this crisis becomes visceral and undeniable. On April 13, 2026, the United States Navy began a blockade of Iranian ports. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't a warning shot. This was the implementation of maximum pressure at the maritime level, and the effects have been immediate, severe, and accelerating in ways that even pessimistic analysts didn't fully anticipate. Before the blockade, Iran was exporting roughly 1.85 million barrels of crude oil per day. That export revenue is not just how the regime funds itself, it is how the Islamic Republic pays its military, maintains its proxy networks across Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, keeps its bureaucracy functioning, and sustains even the most minimal level of economic stability for 90 million people. It is the financial oxygen of the entire system, and the blockade cut that oxygen supply by approximately 70% in the span of 2 weeks. According to commodity analytics firm Kepler, one of the most respected data providers in the global energy market, Iranian crude exports have fallen to around 567,000 barrels per day. Only 5 tracked cargo movements in 2 weeks. For context, that is not a slowdown, that is a near-total shutdown of the arterial system that keeps the regime alive. But here is where it gets even more dangerous, and this is the part that most coverage is glossing over. The blockade is not just cutting Iran's export revenue, it is also cutting off Iran's ability to offload the oil it is still producing. Iran's primary crude export terminal, Karg Island, is filling up. According to data from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, as of April 20th, storage tanks at Karg Island were already approximately 74% full. From April 13th to April 21st, 8 days, Iran's stored oil increased by more than 6 million barrels. The math from Kepler's own analysis is unambiguous. Iran has somewhere between 12 and 22 days of remaining storage capacity before it hits a critical threshold. After that threshold, the choice disappears. Iran doesn't get to decide whether to slow production in an orderly, managed way that preserves the long-term health of its oil fields. It gets forced into a sudden, disorderly shutdown that risks permanent damage to the infrastructure itself. And that word, permanent, is the one that should make everyone stop and pay attention. Columbia University energy expert Antoine Haff explained to CNBC what happens when you force an uncontrolled shutdown of oil production facilities. You disrupt the pressure systems and flow dynamics inside the reservoirs in ways that can make it permanently harder, and in some cases outright impossible, to restore production to previous capacity. Iran's oil sector already suffers from decades of chronic underinvestment and poor reservoir management. Kepler's head of crude oil analysis, Homayoun Falakshari, has pointed out that Iran's average recovery rate, the percentage of oil in any given field that can actually be extracted before operations have to stop, sits at around 25%. That is already well below global norms, damage that already weakened infrastructure further, and the consequences aren't measured in months of lost revenue. They are measured in years of reduced capacity, possibly decades. The senior administration official who told CNBC that Iran is losing approximately $500 million per day due to the blockade wasn't exaggerating. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said publicly on April 22 that Karg Island storage would be full within days and that constraining Iran's maritime trade directly targets the regime's primary revenue lifeline. That is not rhetoric. That is a policy being executed with surgical precision against an adversary with almost no room to absorb the blow. And on top of the oil collapse, the Iranian rial has hit a record low of 1.8 million rials to a single US dollar. Let that number land for a moment. 1.8 million to 1. That is not just an economic statistic. That is the lived reality of inflation, shortages, and cascading price increases hitting tens of millions of ordinary Iranians who have nothing to do with the IRGC's ideology and everything to lose from its decisions. Non-oil trade dropped to just $6.40 billion in March, down 30% from the prior month and 50% lower than the same period a year ago. Iran's economy isn't weakening, it is fracturing. Now here is where the story stops being about oil charts and currency data and starts being about the survival calculus of a government that knows it is running out of time. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the highest security body in the Islamic Republic, held an emergency meeting specifically to assess the risk of mass protests restarting. This is not speculation. This is not outside analysis. This is from internal Iranian security documents. The meeting included presentations from intelligence agencies warning of potential unrest in the coming days. Officials discussed how mounting economic hardship, rising prices, widespread unemployment, severe damage to the petrochemical and steel industries could become the trigger for a renewed protest movement that would make previous uprisings look manageable by comparison. And the estimate shared in that meeting from Iranian officials themselves is that Iran's economy may not be able to withstand more than 6 to 8 weeks of the US naval blockade. 6 to 8 weeks, and by their own admission, that is the optimistic reading. Think about what it means for the people running the Islamic Republic to be sitting in a closed room, reading from intelligence reports and admitting internally that they have perhaps 6 weeks before the economic situation becomes genuinely uncontrollable. These are the same people who for decades told the Iranian public that the regime could absorb any pressure, that sanctions were a badge of honor. That self-reliance was the proof of revolutionary virtue, and now they are privately conceding a countdown clock that terrifies them, because they know what happened the last time that clock ran out. In January 2026, before the current war escalated to its current level, Iran experienced a wave of protests that, by the regime's own internal accounting, came within days of destabilizing its grip on power. Economic grievances, unemployment, inflation, the grotesque mismanagement of an oil-rich country by a corrupt and ideologically rigid ruling class, all of it drove millions of Iranians into the streets. The regime survived, but barely. And the officials in that security meeting know that a repeat of those protests, layered on top of wartime devastation, military humiliation, and the near-total collapse of the export economy, would not be the same kind of crisis. It would be an existential one. And then there is the internet shutdown, which is perhaps the clearest window we have into the psychology of a regime that knows it is losing control. For more than 60 days past the 2-month mark, approximately 99% of Iranians have been cut off from the internet and from the outside world, more than 90 million people silenced. According to the same internal security assessment, the shutdown has left roughly 20% of the workforce, primarily those in the digital economy, effectively unemployed. An additional 2 million jobs in the broader private sector are at risk from the cascading effects of that digital isolation. The regime knows exactly what this costs. It is not confused about the economic damage it is doing to its own country. It is choosing to absorb that damage because it is more afraid of what happens when Iranians can talk to each other and to the world than it is of economic self-destruction. The Islamic Republic is not afraid of the United States Navy. It is afraid of its own people. That one fact tells you everything you need to know about the nature of this regime and the legitimacy it no longer possesses. We are in the middle of this story, and I want to make sure you don't miss a single development as it breaks. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. This is the kind of reporting that matters, not the noise, not the spin, the actual story unfolding in real time. Now let's talk about Russia, because what happened in St. Petersburg on April 27, 2026, reveals something important, not about the strength of the Iran-Russia alliance, but about its limits. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi flew to Russia and sat down with Vladimir Putin at the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Library. He was accompanied by Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister and its ambassador to Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that the significance of the meeting was hard to overestimate. Putin told Araghchi publicly that Russia would do everything that serves Iran's interests and those of the region's peoples. He also confirmed he had received a written message from Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, and sent back his appreciation and best wishes for the leader's good health. That last part, appreciating a written message, not a phone call, not a video conference, a written message, is something we will return to shortly. But first, let's understand what is actually happening here. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Iran stepped up in ways that genuinely mattered to the Russian war machine. Tehran provided Shahed suicide drones. It provided ballistic missiles. It sent Iranian engineers to Russia to help establish domestic manufacturing facilities inside Russian territory so that Russia could produce those drones itself. Iran was a real operational partner to Russia at a moment of maximum Russian need. And the reasonable expectation, by the logic of any alliance relationship, was that Russia would return that partnership when Iran needed it. Russia has not been able to return that favor at the scale Iran needs. Putin is consumed by a war in Ukraine that is eating Russia's military capacity, political attention, and economic reserves. Russian satellites feeding targeting data to Iranian drone systems is not nothing, but it is also not the direct military, economic, and diplomatic backing that Iran needs to survive a sustained confrontation with the United States, and Iran knows it. Araghchi wasn't in St. Petersburg to celebrate a flourishing partnership. He was there to pressure an ally that has under-delivered and to find out whether there is anything more on the table. The preemptive statement from Iranian state media before the meeting even started tells you everything you need to know about the internal dynamic. Iranian diplomats clarified publicly, before a single conversation had taken place, that the delegation was not going there to ask for charity. They were there to coordinate with a strategic partner. Now, in decades of watching diplomatic communications, the rule is simple and almost never broken. You only deny the thing you are clearly about to do. You don't walk into a room and announce unprompted that you are not begging, unless begging is precisely what you are about to do. That statement wasn't really aimed at Washington or Moscow. It was aimed at the Iranian public, at the base of a regime that has built its entire identity around not yielding, not asking, not showing weakness. The mythology was already cracking before the foreign minister boarded his flight. The statement was an attempt to hold the mythology together with both hands while the floor gave way beneath it. From Moscow's perspective, the meeting serves a different purpose entirely. Russia has positioned itself as a potential mediator, offering what Peskov called goodwill and facilitation services acceptable to both sides. This is a playbook Russia has run before. During the Obama-era nuclear negotiations, Russia's appearance of helpfulness gave Moscow credibility in Washington that it then leveraged for entirely unrelated strategic objectives. The difference in 2026 is that the Trump administration is far more skeptical of Russian intentions, has far less institutional patience for multi-party diplomatic architecture, and has made it very clear that it is not looking for Russian co-management of the Iran file. Russia gets to look useful. It does not get to shape the outcome. Now let's get to the diplomacy, because this is where the situation becomes a genuine test of nerve on both sides, and where the gap between what Iran is offering and what the United States will accept reveals just how far apart these two sides still are. Iran submitted a proposal to Washington whose general contours were reported by CNN, NPR, and ABC News, all citing sources familiar with the contents. The proposal, as described by those sources, offers to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for the United States ending its naval blockade, but would push nuclear negotiations to a later, separate stage. The immediate crisis gets resolved, and then the nuclear question gets addressed afterward. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed this directly in a Fox News interview that same day, April 27th, and what he said is one of the most important statements made by any senior U.S. official since this crisis began. The nuclear question, Rubio said, is the reason we are in this in the first place. He described Iran not merely as a radical country, but as a revolutionary one, a regime that exists to export its ideology, that built Hezbollah in Lebanon, that backed Hamas, that funded militias throughout Iraq, that seeks not just to control Iran, but to dominate the entire region. And then he deployed a comparison that was striking in its bluntness. Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz is the equivalent of an economic nuclear weapon, a tool for holding 20% of the world's energy supply hostage. His question, rhetorical but devastatingly precise, was simple. If a regime willing to use an economic nuclear weapon had an actual nuclear weapon, what would it do with it? That is not a question that resolves itself by deferring the nuclear issue to a later conversation. And Rubio's framing makes clear that Washington is not going to let Iran separate those two questions, no matter how much economic pressure is mounting on both sides. That there is a deeper complication here that goes beyond the diplomatic positions on paper, and it is the one that Rubio himself named directly. Even if Iran's foreign ministry and its political leadership want a deal, the question of whether the people who actually control Iran's military capacity, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, are operating on the same timeline and under the same constraints is genuinely unanswered. Rubio described Iran's internal structure as deeply fractured between hardliners who understand they have to run a country and economy, and hardliners who are entirely motivated by theology and are insulated from the consequences of economic collapse. As one analyst told Foreign Policy with clinical directness, even if the economy collapses, the IRGC is fine. They don't depend on the civilian economy the way ordinary Iranians do. The IRGC controls Iran's missile program, its proxy networks, its naval operations in the Gulf. And its tolerance for pain may be structurally different from the rest of the Iranian system, not because it is stronger, but because the costs of that pain fall on people who are not the IRGC. And then there is the question of who is actually in charge. This is the ambiguity that Rubio kept returning to in his Fox News interview, and it is not a procedural detail. It is the central question of this entire crisis. Iran has a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the late Ali Khamenei. The US has indications that he is alive. Rubio confirmed that publicly, but Rubio was also careful and precise about the limits of that assessment. Being alive and being in power, he said, are two very different questions. Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared in public, he has not given a speech, he has not delivered a statement, he communicated with Putin through a written message. Reuters, citing unnamed sources, reported that he has been participating in meetings with senior officials via audio conference. That is the totality of what the outside world has been able to verify about the man who is nominally the supreme authority of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You cannot sign an agreement with a leadership structure that the other side cannot verify. You cannot implement a deal through a chain of command whose continuity and coherence cannot be confirmed. Any agreement reached with the Iranian Foreign Ministry has to survive contact with the IRGC. Any deal signed in one configuration of Iranian internal power has to hold if and when that configuration shifts. These are not rhetorical concerns. They are operational ones that determine whether any agreement is worth the paper it would be written on. Rubio acknowledged that Iran's latest proposal was better than Washington expected. That is a careful, calibrated phrase. It is not yes, it is not acceptable. It is a signal that the gap between the two sides has narrowed since the first proposal was rejected outright, but that the gap is still substantial. Mediators in Pakistan expect an updated Iranian offer within days. Direct communication between US and Iranian officials has occurred in the margins of the Islamabad meetings, which itself represents a significant shift from a system that for years had a formal prohibition on speaking directly to American counterparts. The mechanics of the diplomacy are moving, slowly, under enormous strain, with deep uncertainty about who is actually authorized to make commitments on the Iranian side, but moving. Let's talk about the global stakes, because this crisis is not contained to the Persian Gulf, and the consequences for ordinary Americans are real and direct. Qatar's energy minister warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed through the summer, oil could reach $150 a barrel, and natural gas could hit $40 per million thermal units. The European Central Bank has already postponed planned interest rate reductions and raised its inflation forecast for 2026. Vitol CEO Russell Hardy told investors on April 21st that the war will result in the loss of 1 billion barrels of oil production in total, with current losses already between 600 and 700 million barrels. Economists are warning that sustained energy disruption at this scale could push energy-intensive European economies into technical recession, and every dollar that oil prices climb is a dollar coming out of the pockets of American families at the gas pump, in their utility bills, in the price of every product that had to be transported to get to them. This is not abstract geopolitics. This is the grocery store. This is the commute. This is the heating bill in the winter and the cooling bill in the summer. The people making decisions in Washington and Tehran are making decisions that have direct material consequences for working Americans who have no seat at any of these tables and no vote on any of these outcomes. The American strategic position, as articulated clearly by both Trump and his senior officials, is built on a specific calculation: Iran's economic runway is shorter than America's political runway. The blockade costs the United States nothing in direct military terms. It requires only the sustained deployment of naval assets already positioned in the Gulf. Every day it continues. Iran's oil storage fills a little further, its currency weakens a little more, its internal stability erodes a little further, and the timeline to force production cuts grows a little shorter. A White House official summarized this to CNBC in terms that leave no room for ambiguity. We have all the cards. Iran's counter-argument that it can survive 6 to 8 weeks of blockade, that the IRGC's resolve is immune to economic pain, that Russia's eventual deeper involvement might change the calculation, is only plausible if you assume the internal situation in Iran remains stable. And the regime's own security apparatus has told the regime's own leadership that stability cannot be assumed. Here is where we land, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, because the uncertainty at the center of this crisis is genuine and consequential. Iran's oil infrastructure is approaching a point of irreversible damage, not theoretical damage, not future damage. Damage that could lock in reduced production capacity for years or decades, regardless of what any diplomatic agreement says or when it gets signed. The regime's internal security services have told the leadership they have perhaps 6 weeks before economic conditions produce a protest movement that the security apparatus may not be able to contain. The Foreign Ministry is negotiating with Washington through Pakistani intermediaries and in the margins of Islamabad talks, submitting proposals, revising them, signaling flexibility on some things while holding firm on others. The IRGC is operating on its own logic, under its own command structure, with its own ideological framework that does not automatically align with what the diplomats are saying in Muscat or Islamabad. And sitting somewhere in Tehran, possibly in a secure room, possibly via audio conference, possibly through written messages that no outside observer has been able to independently verify, is a new supreme leader who has never spoken in public, whose command authority cannot be confirmed, and who may or may not be the person actually making the decisions that will determine the future of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is the situation. Not the cleaned-up version, not the version that fits neatly into a headline or a 4-minute segment. The actual situation, with all of its complexity and danger and uncertainty intact. The next proposal from Iran, Washington's response to it, the oil storage data from Karg Island over the next 10 days, the internal situation on the streets of Tehran and Isfahan and Mashhad, all of it matters, and all of it is moving simultaneously toward what may be a genuine breaking point. The question that no satellite image and no commodity report and no diplomatic readout can fully answer is whether the IRGC, the real power center of the Islamic Republic, the organization that has kept fighting even as the political leadership signals exhaustion, whether it has a breaking point that economic pressure can actually reach, or whether its ideological framework genuinely insulates it from the kind of rational cost-benefit calculus that drives normal state behavior. History gives us partial answers. It gives us no guarantees. What is certain is that this cannot hold indefinitely. The physics of oil storage, the psychology of a population under economic siege, the mathematics of currency collapse, none of those forces pause for diplomatic convenience. The situation will force a decision whether the diplomacy is ready for one or not. And the decisions made in the next days and weeks, in closed rooms in Tehran, in the Oval Office, in the State Department, in the margins of meetings in Islamabad, will shape the Middle East, the global energy market, and the lived reality of millions of people for years to come. Stay locked in. Subscribe if you haven't already, turn on your notifications, and drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think the diplomacy gets a deal done before Iran's oil infrastructure forces an involuntary crisis? Or does the IRGC's ideological resolve outlast Washington's patience? I want to hear what you think, because this is the kind of story where the analysis of informed, engaged people actually matters. We are not done with this story, not by a long shot, and neither is the world.